This, as Liz had referenced, is part two of a three-part series that we are presenting in collaboration with the three companies of Strategic Steps, It's Logical, and ResourceX. The key people's email addresses are in the bottom right-hand side corner of the screen if anybody's interested in contacting us after the fact. During the session, if you would like to use the chat function to interject or provide some knowledge, please do. If you want to unmute yourself and just start yelling, we'll probably even listen to that as well. So this is part two of three. Really what we're looking for here is what we are modeling as a concept called great governance. So in the upper right-hand side corner of each one of our slides here is the four pieces we see as leading into great governance. And one of the attributes of this that we have seen or we're providing is that you can really start at any given place. However, given the choice, that well-being baseline and understanding why we are here is kind of the place to start. The manifestation of that shows up then in strategic planning, which is what we're going to talk a bunch about today. And finally, priority-based budgeting kind of puts some flesh on the bones of that strategic plan. Together, as we look at these, we are trying to create this concept of great governance, with the idea being that we're serving the citizens who choose to live in a particular place. We're looking after the businesses that live there too, and the community organizations that add a lot of richness to it. The first part last month was around well-being. And I'm just going to ask Kelly to intervene at this point and speak a little bit to some of the things that he and Mark Anielski were provided last month as part of their session. So Kelly, I'll just turn it over to you for a few minutes.
Sure, thanks, Ian. And it's a little bit unfortunate that Mark isn't here today, but I too am an economist and been a big fan of Mark's work, like Kirsten, for years. So maybe you're getting Mark light today. So yeah, Mark and I discussed how a community visioning conversation is really driven by citizens and their future well-being. That lens of improving citizens' lives is done in a really compelling way using Mark's methodology. And so the well-being efforts with community, it's then fed into, like Ian said, that strategic planning conversation with elected officials and likely some senior administrative folks in the room. We find we're looking for that absolute clarity and what we want to achieve in the future. And I'm a big fan of Simon Sinek as well, and he's that start with your why. And we believe that the big why for a municipality is furthering the well-being of their citizens. And if it's not that, I guess you'd have to ask yourself, what is it then, right? So our narrative looks a bit different than most you might have seen before when a vision statement starts looking through that well-being lens. Like some of the municipal strategic plans that I've seen, a vision statement might sound quite generic, like municipality X will be the preferred place to live, work, and play, or something like that. You see some element of live, work, and play in a lot of them, where with that lens of well-being, this is something that may show up. Our citizens experience conditions that support them in achieving their greatest joy in their lives. So from that, then you start crafting some goal statements that start talking about different parts of your organization and different tools that you have as a municipality to further that vision. And this is an example of what a goal statement might look like. Again, applying that lens all the way through and aligning to that vision. In your social area, you might have a goal statement that suggests we will be a socially connected community, leveraging our social and cultural capital. And using Mark's work, there's a really strong alignment piece to the questions you ask of your community and the tools that you have or the programs that you have in your organization that will then try to achieve maximum value in what you have and achieving this goal. So, and it's a perfect segue for the next video and the next series of work that we do, and Resource X and what they bring to the table. So you when we're done with this, you'll start to see that alignment piece that happens.
So I'll start with this then. This kind of began a conversation that eventually led into the great governance concept, or our great governance with intent. That's kind of the tagline for this. And it was building on what Kelly had said and what Mark has built, is why do people live in a particular place? Why do they stay there? What is it that's caused this gravity to pull people together? And of course, it's whatever the citizens want. If there were no citizens, there would be no requirement for any sort of local government. But the citizens' ideas are manifest, but citizens don't exist in a vacuum, that there needs to be something for them to do. So that's why business is important. And there needs to be something in terms of the interaction between the citizens and how they contribute to their community and how the community can contribute to them. And that's where organizational desires come in as well. And when we talk about community here, a lot of times we're talking about community based on interest rather than based on geography. Sometimes it's both, but if you're part of a book club, for example, it's not restricted by geography. If it's part of a community league or a community association, it is a little bit more restricted by geography. From that, then, of course, there is a local government that gets formed. The government itself has a strategic plan we're going to talk about, but because it can't be all things to all people, it sets priorities based on a vision. The vision then manifests into budget, and we're going to speak a bit more about that next month, a lot more about that next month as we start to talk about putting dollars to what priorities happen to be. And then once the handoff from governance happens, it goes to the organization itself, the municipal structures, a business plan that reflects how to achieve the strategic plan and priorities, and other things that the municipality provides in support of those initial citizen desires. Maria mentioned engagement and communications earlier, so that's a big piece of this as well. As are the measures of identifying how we will know when we've been successful or not, and then communicating that to other people, which directly or indirectly leads to the level of satisfaction that citizens have on the things that they wanted to see done in their community. Satisfaction could be good or it could be bad. Most likely what it's going to be is citizens satisfied with some aspects of their local government and dissatisfied with some other aspects of their local government. Oops, what do we got here? And of course, there's a feedback loop then built into the next iteration or the next year. All this time, as we move through time, we're growing the well-being of the people who live in the community and therefore the community as well. So that was a little bit of a look back in the holistic piece. Today, we're looking at strategic planning. We've termed this as the bridge between the why and the what. The why being why do we live in a particular region, and the what is what we're our particular community, and the what being what is it that we want to see done by our local government in support of the people who live here. And as part of this, we look at what really is the role of the governors and what is the role of the managers or administration. So in my experience in working with lots of elected officials throughout Western Canada and a little bit into the States as well, is that their primary responsibility is to look distantly, look far into the distance, set the vision of success for their community. And Kelly referenced how this can have aspects of well-being built into it as well, to constantly increase the well-being of the people who choose to live in a community, to make them unique, what makes one community different from another. Anybody who puts the term live, work, and play in their vision is, I'm out if they do that, because that's just, as Kelly had said, that's just so generic. And sometimes we even make a joke about it during council work with councils that if they want to use that, it's not something we're interested in doing. But setting that success and then talking about how that success becomes reality, turning what council wants to do, which is the what, handing off then to management to determine how. So there's some examples here of plans that a prudent municipality would have around operational business plans, things like asset management, human resources capital, and then departmental plans. Then of course, there's the actual delivery of the services to the people who live there. And then that feedback loop we talked about already. Budget gets applied based on the strategic plan and other plans that are in place as well, all with the goal of increasing the well-being of the people who live in a particular community.
Ian, I'm going to
Yes.
throw a little curveball to you, and it was prompted by a couple of slides back and this one, and my mention about the narrative being different. And I would just want to share with the group that, and it was talked about with Mark a little bit. Mark's work is an amazing reporting back tool as well. So that is something that is done with intent yearly, so that you see how that we're moving the needle on well-being. And those reporting elements start looking a lot richer than maybe just what your taxes were, or, you know, we send out those bills and they show how much is spent in each area of the organization.
Mhm.
When you start reporting back on well-being and well-being metrics, it's a lot richer conversation. So sorry for interrupting, but
No,
I just want to take that opportunity. Thanks.
so we're trying to encompass all of these things in that great governance concept. So everything does tie together. And so thanks, Kelly, for bringing that up. Strategic planning, of course, when I speak to strategic planning and people ask me to describe it, oftentimes people think about it looking ahead, which is, I think, ultimately the desired outcome. But in order to understand what we want to do in the future, we need to think a little bit about what happened in the past and where we are at the moment. And the value of looking back, I think, is twofold. The first is to recognize that those who came before us did do some good planning that got the community to where it is right now, and to recognize that some of that work isn't done. So there's a likelihood that some of that would need to carry forward, and there's no desire to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There might be some needing to tweak what's happened, and that's perfectly legitimate. The second part is in itself a little bit twofold. One is to recognize that there was work that got done, and how did we celebrate that? The public sector isn't very good at celebrating success, so putting some conscious thought into that, whether it is the reporting that Kelly referenced or some other event that might happen to celebrate the good work of the community and perhaps reinforce for people who work in that municipality that actually what they're doing has value. The flip side of that, of course, is that not everything that we wanted to get done got done. And it's to think about why not. Were there scope changes? Were there pandemics that mean we had to do things differently? Were there different priorities that happened partway through a year? And that's always legitimate. I think I suggest to people, if they're hitting all the targets they set for themselves, they're sandbagging a little bit. If they're hitting 75, 80% of the targets they set for themselves, I think that's quite legitimate. But just the analysis of why things didn't work gives us the ability to turn that focus forward and anticipate those things looking ahead, and maybe adapt our thinking into the ahead piece. So that's the looking back and some carry forward into the new plan. Then there's today's analysis too. Recognizing that no strategy survives first contact with reality. We recognize that when we plan for 4 years into the future or a generation into the future, something is going to change between now and then. Maybe there's a resource price change, maybe there's an economic shift, maybe there's a depression or a housing bubble. Those sorts of things will all have an impact on what can actually be done. So those shifts in the environment and the internal resources that are available to actually deliver on priority become important, as does the question of capacity. Does the municipality have the ability to deliver everything that everybody wants? And the answer, of course, is no. The resources can be people, or they can be time, they can be money or political capital or opportunity cost, or any number of those sorts of things. So knowing what we have the capability of delivering will have a real impact on the plan looking forward. I believe that councils and administrations want each other to be successful. And so trying to avoid those gotcha conversations becomes really important, as does being able to define the difference between wants and needs. Council rarely enjoys cutting the ribbon on a new sewer system. But the fact is that sewer system has been degrading for the last 50 years and needs to be replaced. So administration management has a good understanding of that through things like asset management plans and hiring professionals like engineers. Those are some of the things that need to be done. I sometimes speak about council's work being 4 buckets of things that need to be done over time. The first one is being legacy items that get carried forward from the previous council, which is part of that look back. Part of that is things that get handed down from other orders of government. So in Canada, the legalization of marijuana federally had an impact on local governments in terms of zoning and bylaws or ordinances that they had to take into account. Then there's the third thing is something that has to be done because of a crisis. So there was a fire or a flood or something bad happened and the municipality has to react. And finally, the fourth item is actually what the new members of council wanted to see done, things that were on their platforms. And unfortunately, that becomes, we do with that what's available, what's left. Sorry. As Kirsten has said, we should in fact start cutting ribbons on sewers, and she's probably right, because a lot of those things are really quite important. So that shifts then between wants and needs. Then when we turn our focus ahead, if we haven't learned from what the unexamined life is not worth living, was according to Socrates. And so we've examined our life, we look forward, starting from vision and working our way down. Kelly referenced the vision reference associated with well-being, about what success looks like sometime into the future. Then we look at the mission of how we're going to get there, and then thinking about a series of values or lenses through which we would make decisions. I see vision and mission. I prefer vision first about where we're going to be. Some organizations will put mission first. I don't think it matters that much as long as they are both there and both aligned to one another, and there's a downward cascade. From that, the big picture thinking, then we're looking at setting goals, which is change over time. And if we're looking at a strategic plan that may have a vision a generation into the future, and we've just bid off 3 or 4 or 5 years in terms of the scope of this particular plan, those are the types of goals that we're looking for, the change that we're trying to bring to increase the well-being of what's happening in our community. Then as part of that, we have a series of strategies and actions. And we see this come into play, particularly shortly after an election, when new elected officials have been at the doorsteps, although maybe not as much during COVID, but have at least heard from the voters about the things that they want, the transactional stuff. We need to try and elevate that to the level of goal or strategy. So we use an example of potholes. Everybody has a concern with filling potholes in the community. And it's not the filling of the potholes that is at a governance level. So the question about why do you want to fill the potholes comes into play. And so we start talking about smooth roads, and why do you want smooth roads? Well, for efficient transportation. Why do you want efficient transportation? And then you start talking about things like economic development or economic sustainability, or just having the ability of people to interact with one another. And those sort of things are where I think we start getting to the goal aspect. Now, filling the potholes might be a program that's a legitimate program, but it's not something that ought to show up in a strategic plan. What gets measured gets done. So setting things like timelines and accountability about who ought to do what is important. Now, timelines can be flexible, again, because of some of the things that no strategy surviving contact with the reality. Some of those things are going to change. And then we're looking at measures as well, and we'll speak a little bit about that just a little bit later. Before we move on from this, Kelly, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to this.
Well, your idea about potholes is, I love pothole conversations because to me, they're a classic example of a very localized decision. And I always envision the actual shovel filling the pothole, right? The actual mix going into the hole. Maybe that's because that's how I started my career in municipal government, doing that over the summer. But to your point, when does filling potholes get in the way of the actual goal of having better roads? Like, should you, those bigger decisions need to come into play? And that's where I think our process leads to is, not letting the minutia get in the way of moving the needle on some bigger priorities that we have. And then asking yourself especially when Eric and Resource X's piece of this puzzle come into play, weighing that pothole filling versus the same mix could be building a trail. And maybe we want to drive community well-being and health, and that same effort and same product could be going towards building a trail as opposed to filling a pothole. So it's just those kind of conversations that are a lot richer, and we use that term a lot, but when you wear that lens of value for citizen and maybe that well-being idea, like maybe the pothole shouldn't be filled, maybe the trail should be built instead.
Right. And if anybody else wants to pop in at this point or at any point, in fact, they're more than welcome to. Kirsten, you turned your light on.
Yeah, I have some thoughts about the about this. Well, I had some thoughts about the engagement communication thing too, but in my experience working with communities, I find that the minutia is reflecting. Often people will identify things like potholes or parking or the height of a building or whatever it is, because it's the most concrete way to sort of attach, to sort of like identify what it is that's creating their anxiety or frustration or friction in the community, or getting around or whatever it is. But it's often not the solution to that problem. And so I think too often we get caught up in the minutia by going down the literal hole of things like potholes. It doesn't mean we don't need to deal with potholes, but I think there's a real opportunity in the way we communicate and work with communities, which is part of where, like with the engagement communications piece, I feel that that's a scaffolding piece to probably run through the process, but to help say, okay, you're frustrated because your roads aren't very good and they bump and you're worried about damaging your car. But what is it about, your daily, like, what is it about your life that this is actually impacting? And moving people into a place of talking about what they love in their community and what they want to prioritize. I think that's the desire piece, but so often we hear the desire of, I want the potholes fixed, I want good services, I want low taxes, I want no change in my neighborhood. And of course, that's not necessarily realistic. And what they really want is they know their neighbors, they have a lot of green space, they have amenities close to them, doing things, there's less friction in daily life, right? So being able to pivot from those frustrations into that more positive frame and help give people practical tools, practical solutions that may not necessarily involve filling all the potholes, but that tie directly back to that, I think is really important.
I completely agree with you. And I like the way you talk about concrete solutions, because so often the solutions that people are looking for is literally concrete or lack of concrete in some ways.
Absolutely.
So, to me, what the pothole gets filled, whether it's a real one or a metaphorical one. If the municipality is doing its job, the strategy is correct, the public works people are out there with their shovels, whether it's a trail, whether it's a pothole, whether it's a change in zoning, that's fine, as long as those are all appropriate, as long as the head of the beast has pointed the beast in that direction. The body ought to follow along. What interests council should fascinate municipal administration. So, Kirsten, I certainly agree with you. And I know Maria here, but if you want more detail on engagement and communications, I can't think of a better person to reconnect with than Maria, of course. So certainly reconnect.
So Kirsten, for me, what you mentioned is exactly why we added the words with intent. And when I think of that intent, it's that narrative and that relationship with the community. And right now, I think municipal government or government in general is just very complacent with their conversations and their relationship with the public right now. And we've convinced ourselves that there's a lot of value in talking about taxes and talking about the potholes, when there is just this enormous opportunity, especially this COVID time, when we've all been given an opportunity to pause and reflect and be better on the other side of it. There's just way richer conversations when we can talk about how can we make your life better? What do you want to see in your future? What does the future well-being of your family or your community look like? And reporting back, I know we're all close to the city of Edmonton. The dashboard they have up literally talks about filling potholes, and to me, that's a broken measure to be putting on a website. We should be having richer conversations, and I talk to people in Edmonton, and they know that, right? It's just we need to get ourselves over that hump to have the different conversations.
Yeah, well, and I think a piece of that is also around internal engagement and whether folks within administration actually feel supported and empowered and get and have the skills to be able to move into those spaces and have those relationships, and especially dealing with the difficult conversations. I mean, too often we see change pushes coming, but there's these places where they get stuck, and people on the front line end up sort of bearing the brunt of like both the community pushback as well as sometimes council or even senior leadership. And so that risk piece becomes again, which is why I go back to the change process, because I think it's both an internal and an external process in terms of dealing with people's reactions to doing things differently.
Thanks. I'm going to leave it there and just keep moving if we can. Happy to re-engage or engage with you too, Kirsten, after the fact. Some of the stuff now we are going to start, some of the material we have dealt with a little bit. This is an image from my book, and it talks about who we are and what we do. So it talks about that cascade to the aspiration of a vision of a successful community a generation from now, and then how we get to where we need to get to. So from the vision, the mission, and the values, which are how the head of the beast sets itself a perspective sometime in the future. And then we look at how we do those things through goals, strategies, and performance measures. Some of these things can be a little bit situational as well. In a city of 1 million people, a goal will be necessarily very high level. If I'm looking at a town of 1,000 people, what they see in their strategic plan may not even show up in the register in the strategic plan of that larger city, just because of the orders of magnitude. And we use a term here called wise practice, talking about what's a best practice seen elsewhere that's adapted for a local circumstance. So what's a wise practice, Kirsten, for you in the city of Edmonton would not necessarily be, it would be a best practice in a small regional community as well. So those sorts of things, we think this is very important. When we're doing strategic planning as well, we're looking for this alignment. Is there anything that the community or the council wants to do that doesn't help us achieve that particular vision that we're looking for? And if the answer to that question is yes, there are a couple of possibilities. One is that the thing that we're doing isn't something that we ought to be doing, which gets us to some of the priority-based budgeting that we're going to talk to a little bit later. The other option, of course, is the vision is wrong, and the vision can change over time as communities change, as strategies change, and as the environment changes as well. You'll recognize this as a logic model. And the logic model, I think, is a really useful way to explain how we got from here to there. And I'm a big proponent, while doing strategic planning, of involving everyone. Now, everyone can involve engaging the broader community at large in advance of a plan, or in the institution of a plan after it's been created by the community. It could also include identify how we involve the actual physical people in the creation of the plan over the course of its generation. And sometimes I'm a little cautious if a strategic planning session or workshop only involves elected officials, because they are less likely to identify that sewer system needs to be replaced than, say, a public works director is. I'm also a proponent of it, if there's a union in the community, of involving the head of the union as well. Looking to generate buy-in in advance of the creation of the plan, to get that, again, to Kelly's point, the richness of that conversation. It also helps increase the number of people in the actual physical workshop, and I think that there's a benefit to that too. Having 15 or 20 people gathered around having this conversation is better than having 5 or 7 or 9 people involved in the conversation. We've already talked about evolving those to-do lists into strategic goals. When we start talking about priority-based budgeting, this is where we are looking at identifying the programs and how they provide value to the community at large, or to at least a significant portion of the community. Knowing what's on the table is really useful to identify what has to be done. We talk about smart activities here as well in terms of the goals of getting back to what gets measured gets done. And I'm also a bit of quite a proponent of hearing the elected officials' words show up in the strategic plan. And sometimes I'll talk to a city manager who says sometimes those words aren't strategic in nature, and they might be a little bit more operational than what some of the things that we'd like to see in a plan. But if the plan is actually owned by the elected officials, they're more likely to abide by it as well. So these are some of the tactics that I would use. And it's, I mean, it doesn't really speak to the how you run a strategic planning session, but it does talk to me anyway, speak to some of the outcomes that we're looking for. And again, some of the inputs that we put into this. Kelly, was there something you wanted to comment on this one as well?
Well, I like the idea of including counselors' words, and I'll tell you one of the more powerful sessions I was involved with actually had Chris in the room. So we had priority-based budgeting in mind as a next step after the strategic planning session. But we did move council towards not using their words, but we actually had them start crafting an actual statement. So that really upped the game as far as ownership. Their literal sentences that they were given to us showed up in a strategic plan and were very, very clear objectives for the organization to then align their resources, time, and effort around. So it done well, it can really bring that ownership piece and that alignment, right? So community gives marching orders to council. Council gives marching orders to the organization. And if everybody owns their piece and embraces and cherishes that opportunity and makes it real, it can be a very powerful tool.
Right, good. This now starts to morph from purely strategic planning into narrowing the focus from that big bucket of stuff that a council wants to do down to the most important and most timely things in the short term. So when we're looking at a vision of a generation and a strategic plan of 4 years, we can now narrow that down, say, to the next year, recognizing you can't be all things to all people. And if you were, every community on this continent would be homogeneous, and that's not what we're looking for. There is richness, if you like, in that diversity. What makes one city or town different from the next city or town provides a lot of value. I spoke a little earlier too about the types of resources that are available, and not all, you can't be everything to everybody. So as we bite off manageable chunks, we're looking at the top 2, 3, 4, 5 priorities, highest priorities for the coming year. And I use this really simple matrix around importance and timeliness to identify high, medium, and low priority. And they're all relative to one another based on the resources that are available to it. So as we get into priority-based budgeting, we set the level, essentially, of what money is available to fund the programs, the services, the facilities, the amenities that a community, local government can provide. And anything above that level gets funded, and that which is below the level doesn't get funded. I recognize that's really simplistic, but that's as we look at priorities. We also know in this case that priorities will change over time. For the reasons I mentioned earlier. Some resources will be freed up because some work got done. Some priorities will become moot because of some environmental change. Some priorities just may not be able to be done as well, in which case we can free up those resources. I tend not to work in a purely ordinal top to bottom in terms of priority because the resources that are being leveraged for recreation and the roads which are being leveraged for public works, other than money, tend to be different, particularly around staff and expertise and that sort of thing. Even if there isn't a strategic plan in place, the budget is a fiscal manifestation of priority. So you put your money where your mouth is, into your desires. And finally, as we look towards setting these priorities, particularly if it's done on a regular basis and reviewed regularly, it shows that the elected people and those who are appointed from the city manager on down are pulling together. So that's just a quick note on priority. Kelly, anything from you on that?
No, just that I liked your suggestion about priorities and how, we do want that stick-to-itiveness. You don't want to be willy-nilly about your priorities, but there is flexibility built in, and there's yearly check-ins. And I also like the segue to when Resource X is going to be talking about how they introduce the idea of priorities in their ranking matrix, but they also talk about attributes and things like percentage of community that's impacted by the programs or level of ordinance that you're following. There's other factors that come into play, not just looking strictly at the priority, but also there's other attributes that come into play.
Thanks. I mentioned earlier, what gets measured gets done, or the unexamined life is not worth living. And this is where this comes to play. The strategic plan, once created, needs to be kept alive. And what I find is reasonable without adding unnecessary or onerous work is this type of a cycle. If we have a series of high priorities, those can be worked and reported on a quarterly basis. Now, whether it's 4 times a year or 3 times a year doesn't really matter. But reporting on those suggests that there's some activity happening on those high priorities. And sometimes council needs to help remove some barriers as well to things getting done. And if council is interested, then management is fascinated. And that cascades on down the line. It doesn't go up the line, of course, but it does go down. If we look at what happens on a year, that's maybe an appropriate time to review and revise the priorities to recognize what was high priority last year may not be high priority this year. And a lot of places will report to the community at that stage. Some will do it in an ongoing live fashion through dashboards and things like that. Others will put out an annual report or a state of the city address, those kind of things. Then quadrennially, so once every 4 years, typically an election cycle, based on election cycle, is to review the strategic plan. The current council can't bind a future council, but it sure can provide some direction. My recommendation typically is that the strategic plan actually is pushed forward 1 year into a council cycle. So the new council, when it comes into office, inherits the previous council's strategic plan for a year as they learn what's important for them as a council. In the same way, they hand off to the next council by giving them a leg up on the first year of that subsequent council as well. There is another piece to this as well in terms of the internal. And that is, as the strategic plans become activated in administration, there are reporting cycles going on within the body of the organization as well. So this is just a high level concept of what seems to be an appropriate way of looking at ongoing reviews of the strategic plan to keep it alive. Kelly, anything?
No, just I've actually observed when when municipalities have done this extremely well, things that you see in the strategic plan and this reporting cycle start showing up actually in job descriptions and job performance of individual staff members. So again, to that alignment where every part of the organization, if this is done with intent and done well, every level of the organization can see that alignment all the way from, you know, what they do on a day-to-day basis, all the way up to the strategic plan and the vision.
Okay, thanks. And I did put a note here too. Again, it's useful at the very top. I didn't mention it, but essentially it talks about what Kelly's used to talking about. So that takes us from the creation of the strategic plan. And when we're looking forward at setting priorities to citizen well-being, I'm about to turn it over to, I think, probably to Chris. But before I do that, we talked a little bit about the mechanics of the strategic planning system in terms of how it becomes part of great governance and with intent as well. I wonder if anybody had any comments or questions at that point before we move on.
Ian, I just have a question on, so thinking back to the process that you outlined for the strategic planning, so the process management component. In your experience, where did people get stuck in that process? So you talked about, you know, the fact that you are a proponent of the looking back phase,
Yeah.
Looking at where you're at currently, and then moving to the look forward piece. So have you had any experiences where people kind of get bogged down in that process, and what are some options to try and overcome that?
The biggest bog down, if you like, is moving from tactical to strategic. Some people have a natural aptitude to be able to think at a governance level. A lot of people don't. A new elected official coming in, rookie green person, may have been part of a working board and is used to actually doing stuff rather than a governance board, and sometimes has a hard time thinking to that level. So we use that 5 why model to try and move them from the tactics to the strategic. That tends to work sometimes, but if someone has come into office on a change platform, I'll give you an example. I was doing a strategic planning session last week, And there were 4 members of a 7-person council who got elected on a change platform because they were upset about a zoning decision that the town had made, or the previous council had made, and they wanted to overturn it. And so, I mean, zoning in terms of specific lots, I think they didn't like, well, anyway, they didn't approve this decision. So trying to get them to focus A, at zoning in an overall community fashion, and B, at knowing that this particular zoning decision was not a council decision, it was based on a permitted use, was quite important to get them to think above that. And also then to broaden the thinking beyond that single issue, to just get them to recognize that their responsibility to the community was far broader than just zoning. That they were in charge of things like recreation programs. And really, they had never thought of that. And there was no difference between those new elected officials and me, other than they got more votes than I did. Not that I ran, but so they had no specialized knowledge. There's no certification you have to go through to become an elected official, any of those sorts of things. The other big thing I see bogged down is some people just want to get her done. They don't want to think about the look. They don't want to spend any time looking back, or we're looking at where we are. They think their vision and mission are just fluff. And they just want to come up with a list of stuff that they want to do for the next 4 years. And so getting them to stop and look back and see value in it can be a bit of a problem. A challenge, if you want to say that. But as we frame that in what do you want to carry forward, let's not do work that we don't have to redo. That works a little bit. Some people will never manage to convince that a vision statement is important. They just have their ideas of stuff that they want to do. Marie, I don't know if that answers your question, or if anybody else wants to pop in on it as well.
No, it does. Thank you. And I think it has a good tie into what Kirsten was saying earlier about where people enter the conversation and where you're trying to get them to.
Yeah.
Just thinking about what that looks like from a process perspective, and where to start that conversation to try and make that movement. And I agree, it is hard for them to get to the broader picture and the visionary piece, but sometimes that's probably where they need to start, and then see where everything falls in after that. So yeah, just curious if that's been your experience. So thank you for sharing that.
It has, and I suggest a lot of places we work, it's the first time they've ever done a strategic plan. And I tell them it's not going to be perfect. It's going to be good. The next one is going to be better, and that it's an iterative process. That I suggest that they make their logic explicit so that future councils will understand why they made the choices that they made, but recognize that they are doing something, and doing something is better than not doing anything at all.
Yeah, so I think there's a piece of that meaning making work that needs to be done with them, right, in order to move in that direction. So
another issue I sometimes run into, and particularly in the bigger communities where there are lots of professionals on staff who do planning, is that sometimes the elected officials feel railroaded, that there are more staff who are involved in strategic planning than there are elected officials who are involved in strategic planning. And so the minority voice comes to the governors, who are ultimately the accountable ones. And that's something for municipal administrations to really be aware of. And it's also then begs the question about who is involved in various aspects of strategic planning. So while we want the experts in the room as we're talking about things like goals and strategies, I always ask the question about when we're embarking on a priority setting exercise, I always ask the question of council, is this just a council exercise, or would you like your administration involved as well? And we can differentiate that just through the democracy exercise we do. But it almost exclusively, the answer is almost exclusively, we want the elected officials and administration to participate. But when push comes to shove, the final decision comes to council, or becomes council's. Kirsten, you were going to jump in there at one point, I think.
Well, I was just thinking about the whole issue of political capital, and recognizing that, my sense is when I present to council, I'm often spending a lot of time talking about the fact that they're still going to get opposition even if they move forward with their vision, and that they have to be prepared to cope with that, right? But that also they need to help with scaffolding communities into the process. And so I guess any further thoughts on sort of that how elected officials, especially if they don't have a lot of experience, and like your example of running on a, we don't like this new project, and yet the entire process leading up to that is something that's sort of out of their wheelhouse, and they need to, there's a whole learning process that needs to come into play. But then they also need to go back out into community. They got more votes and they now have to go back out into community and somehow, defend a change in position or those sorts of things. I was just curious. I mean, I have thoughts about that, but I'm curious about your sort of observations or what you've seen work or where you've seen challenges.
It's never about what it's about. So I see, as the elected officials begin to understand their role, they start to have some of these aha moments about why things are the way they are, changes that they can or can't make, or something that's perhaps more appropriate in a different order of government that they can't do anything about. How local governments really have nothing to do with the postal system or national defense. So that's one of the reasons I like or promote pushing the strategic plan forward a year, is so that the new elected official begins to get their feet under them, begins to understand what they can and can't do. Oftentimes, councillors are elected or choose to run because they've been involved in their community and they see this as another way to serve the community. And if that is the case, they've often built up some good, as you mentioned, Kirsten, political capital over the years that they can use as part of this process to identify what their goals, strategies, actions, priorities happen to be. For those who come in raw and green and just want to be the boss, they've got a real problem because they don't have that community background. They don't often have the deep pool of people that they can rely on to provide them with that counsel and advice. I've seen some elected officials wisely bring in a concept like a kitchen cabinet, an informal group of people that they meet with from time to time, who don't always agree with them, who are people from across the political spectrum, across the interest spectrum, across the demographic and geographical spectrum. So those are some of the tools that I have seen work. That's more so in the bigger communities than it would be in the small communities, where local elected officials are known because they run into each other at school, at church, the grocery store. And quite often local community members are more than happy to share their perspectives on the issues of the day.
So Ian, a couple of things that I've recognized maybe structurally or systemically. So an elected official, if they're new, especially, comes in and they get elected to office at the end of October. The first thing that happens to them here in our world, and I don't know if it's similar across other jurisdictions, but they're told they have to pass a budget. And it's true. They start talking about budget right away, and they've probably been told along the way, budget's the most important thing that you'll do. So strategic planning is battling against that right at the outset. So, even things like the MGA also doesn't talk about that. The MGA is our rules for being, right? As a municipality, talks at length about how to dissolve being, but doesn't talk about the strategic planning. So I think our process of introducing the idea of well-being and that very rich citizen engagement and a different narrative helps in that battle to start thinking bigger picture rather than some of the other pieces to their more granular conversations that they have when they come in. Budget's important, but like we've stressed, it's a manifestation of decisions that have already been made.
I'm going to keep going. We're looking at the time here. We started a little late. We're going to make up for it by finishing a little bit late. But we'll stick around if anybody has any questions after the fact. I'm going to turn it over now. I think, Chris, you're here and you're nodding. So as we look forward to next month, these are the 3 sessions we're holding. We've held the Wellbeing Baseline in March. The Strategic Planning Framework, of course, is today. And Priority-Based Budgeting is coming up next. And so I'll just turn that over to Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Ian, and thanks everybody for sticking around for a little bit longer. What Kelly just said is so true. The budget is kind of the punchline for everything that you have established. And I liked how Ian was describing from strategic planning perspective. Sometimes this is the first time a community has really done this. The first time will be good. The next one will get better. Sometimes all we see is a strategic plan, but it's not backed up by anything. And a strategic plan without a budget that is going to allow you to fulfill the vision that you've worked so hard to create is fiction. It's frustrating, to say the least. And so we get really excited that, well, nobody gets excited about the budget, but some people do, to align resources to back up the vision that you're trying to create is the finality, the conclusion that we want to be able to create. In our work in priority-based budgeting, we've worked with Kelly over the years, is to take this thing that can seem really complicated, has its accounting rules, has strings attached for how resources can be used, certainly has turf issues for how departments are trying to shepherd or look out for their own resources. We're trying to take all of that into consideration and say, you can tie resources to the programs that you provide. We can look at those programs now with a way to connect them to your strategic plan framework and really come up with a different way to understand your budget in terms of, is it aligned with what you're trying to achieve, or is it not actually aligned? And where might you have reallocation opportunities to get stronger, to get further aligned with what you're trying to accomplish? So we're going to be really pumped to deliver that on May 20th, and hope that you'll come and tune in to see how all the pieces come together.
Sure, that's great. Thanks very much. So that's 10:30 Central, 9:30 Mountain, 8:30 Pacific, and then the rest of it. So this is just what Chris had mentioned, and we've been going with some questions as we go throughout. But that kind of wraps up our time for the moment. And I'd like to say thank you to everybody who helped pull this together and is listening to us. And if you have questions, here's our contact information. And I'm not going to hang up here until we've run out of questions, if anybody has any. But so thanks very much for